The canyon was already becoming a graveyard. 12 Navy SEALs, the best operators in the United States military, were surrounded, outgunned, and bleeding in the dark somewhere inside Ashford Canyon, and command had just declared their rescue impossible. No aircraft, no extraction, no options. One soldier had a sucking chest wound, and maybe 40 minutes before the blood loss made the decision for everyone. The enemy knew exactly where they were, and the only pilot alive who had memorized every wind current, every altitude shift, every hidden escape route through that canyon, the one person who could actually reach them, had been grounded, stripped of her flight status, told she was a liability. Her name was Major Leah Vance, call sign Storm 01, and they had made a catastrophic mistake. If this story already has you on edge, stay with me. Hit subscribe, drop a like, and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go. The paperwork that grounded Major Leah Vance was 12 pages long and smelled like burned politics. She sat in the small office adjacent to the Flight Operations Center at Kessler Air Base and read every page twice, the way she always read things, methodically, without expression, picking out the specific language someone had chosen very carefully. Operational risk assessment, elevated. Flight judgment under evaluation. Temporary maintenance restriction pending review. That last phrase was the one that stuck. Pending review. It was the kind of language that could sit on a file for 6 months while someone's career quietly decomposed underneath it. She set the papers on the desk and looked out the narrow window at the flight line. 3. A-10 Thunderbolts were parked in a row, their engines cold, their landing gear chalked. One of them was hers, or had been. Colonel Darnell Greer walked in without knocking, which was his habit, and sat across from her like he was doing her a favor by showing up at all. He was a large man who had spent 20 years mastering the art of looking busy while avoiding accountability. "You read it?" he said. 3 times, Leah said. "Good. Then you understand the situation. I understand someone wrote a report using words like elevated risk profile without citing a single incident." Greer's jaw tightened. "You deviated from a designated flight path during the Tanner Ridge exercise. That's documented. I deviated because there was a civilian helicopter drifting into my corridor without a transponder signal. I filed a full account within 2 hours. You made a unilateral call without notifying your flight lead. My flight lead was 6 miles out, and I had about 9 seconds. She kept her voice level. Not because she wasn't angry, she was, in a specific cold way, but because raising her voice would give Greer exactly the kind of leverage he was fishing for. If I'd done nothing, a civilian bird with 4 people on board clips my wing. Best case, they go down. Worst case, everybody goes down. Greer looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who had already made a decision and was simply waiting for the conversation to catch up. The restriction stands, he said, pending review. How long? That's not determined. Approximate range? Weeks? Months? Major Vance. He stood, which seemed to be his way of signaling that the discussion was over, regardless of whether it actually was. This isn't personal, it's procedural. She watched him walk out and thought, it is exactly personal. You just need it not to look that way. Leah had been at Kessler for 14 months, which was long enough to understand the informal hierarchy that operated underneath the official one. The base housed 2 A-10 squadrons and a joint special operations coordination cell, and the culture had calcified around a set of senior pilots who treated the aircraft like instruments of personal status. Seniority determined assignments. Seniority determined who got the good briefings, the interesting missions, the latitude to operate creatively. And Leah, who had transferred in from a forward deployment in Karvish province with a distinguished record and a reputation for unconventional problem-solving, had made the mistake of being very good at things people didn't want her to be good at. She wasn't unaware of how she came across. She knew she was direct in a way that some read as arrogance. She had opinions about tactics and didn't always wait to be asked for them. She had once, at a joint planning session, corrected a senior officer's wind calculation in front of 6 other people, politely, factually, without intention to embarrass, and the room had gone quiet in a way that told her she had just spent something she hadn't realized she was carrying. But none of that was why she'd been grounded. She'd been grounded because she was better at flying Ashford Canyon than anyone else on base, and because the officer who'd written her restriction report was Captain Dowell Strand, who had tried to fly that canyon 6 weeks ago during a training simulation and quietly washed out of it, and who had looked at Leia's debrief data afterward and understood what it meant for his own standing. She knew this. She couldn't prove it. She filed the restriction paperwork in a folder and started thinking about next steps. What she didn't stop doing, because she was constitutionally incapable of stopping, was studying the canyon. Ashford Canyon was a 43-kilometer stretch of high-walled terrain in the mountain range northwest of the base, a geological formation that had been used for combat training exercises for years, and that the military simultaneously loved and feared. The walls topped out at around 8,000 feet on the northern rim, lower and more irregular on the south side. Wind behavior inside the canyon was unlike anything in standard flight manuals. Thermal columns that appeared and collapsed without warning, rotor wash that could destabilize an aircraft before the pilot registered the input, narrow corridors where the safe flight envelope was measured in dozens of feet rather than hundreds. 3 aircraft had gone down in that canyon over the past decade. 2 of the pilots hadn't come back. Leia had first flown it 6 months ago as part of a routine canyon familiarization rotation, and she had immediately understood that the official guidance on it was dangerously incomplete. The flight manuals described the canyon as it behaved under average conditions. The canyon under average conditions was not the canyon you needed to worry about. She'd started running her own data collection, pulling meteorological records, cross-referencing with satellite imagery, building a 3-dimensional model of the thermal behavior at different altitudes and times of day. She had logged 47 hours studying Ashford Canyon on her personal time, in the evenings, on weekends, while her peers went to the bar on base and talked about football. Nobody had asked her to do this. Nobody knew she'd done it. It was just, the canyon was a problem, and she was someone who could not look at an unsolved problem without wanting to understand it. Her model was sitting in a file on her personal laptop when the SEAL team's final transmission went silent. She heard it through the operations center wall. She was in the adjacent room doing mandatory ground-based paperwork, part of what the maintenance restriction required, when the voice traffic from the Joint Operations Cell changed pitch. She'd spent enough years in proximity to military communications to recognize the specific sound of a situation degrading. Short transmissions, overlapping voices, someone calling for a supervisor. She walked to the door that connected the 2 spaces and opened it. The Ops Center had 8 workstations and a large display screen on the far wall that currently showed a topographic overlay of the mountain region northwest of the base. The overlay had a red indicator cluster somewhere inside the western section of Ashford Canyon. People were moving around the room with the controlled urgency of people who'd trained for exactly this, and were now discovering that training doesn't prepare you for how it actually feels. A communications officer named Specialist Preet Hira was at the primary radio station with her headset pressed against both ears, typing rapidly. Leia came up beside her. "What happened?" Leia said. Hira glanced at her sideways. "Bravo 7 went dark. 12-man SEAL team, canyon insertion. Something went wrong with the egress. They're taking fire in the western corridor." "Casualties?" "At least 1 confirmed. Maybe more." Leia looked at the display. The indicator cluster was inside a section of the canyon she had mapped extensively, a section she thought of as the shoulder, where the southern wall angled inward and created a compression zone that made flying difficult but not impossible if you knew the specific altitude windows. She had 3 pages of notes on the shoulder alone. "Who's available to fly?" she said. Hira's expression flickered. "That's what Command is working on. Raker 6 just came back with a fuel system fault. DuPont 2 is on a scheduled mission out of contact range. There are 2 helicopters, but they're being told the canyon is too hot with the storm system. The storm system moves through the western section after about 2:15, Leia said. There's a window. A window of approximately 20 to 30 minutes where the wind in the western corridor drops below the threshold for the HH-60 operational ceiling. If someone is in position before that window, they can make the extraction. Hira stared at her. How do you know that? Major Rob Causey, the shift supervisor, appeared at Laya's elbow. He was a decent pilot and a precise bureaucrat, and he looked at her with the expression of someone who had just identified a problem. Vance, he said, you're on ground restriction. I'm aware. Then you need to step back. I'm telling you there's a window in the storm pattern between 0215 and 0240 that makes the Western Corridor flyable. If Command is evaluating options, that's information they should have. Causey hesitated. It was a brief hesitation, the kind that happened when procedure and reality were pulling in different directions. Where are you getting this? He said. 47 hours of personal study on Ashford Canyon meteorology, she said. I can show you the data. Another voice cut in across the room. Lieutenant Commander Bryce Thayer from the Joint Ops Cell had come out of his office and was standing with a phone to his ear and his eyes on the display. He was the kind of officer who made decisions by making them, rather than consulting committees about them. What's the status on available aircraft? He said to the room. A-10s are available but restricted from the canyon under current weather assessment, Causey said. Helicopters are on standby pending storm evaluation. Thayer looked at Laya because she was the person in the room who looked like she had something to say. You know something? He said. Yes, sir. Say it. She laid it out in 2 minutes. The thermal pattern, the window, the altitude corridor, what was and wasn't possible in the shoulder section of the Western Canyon under current conditions. She was aware that several people in the room were watching her with varying degrees of skepticism and one or two with something that might have been interest. She was also aware that Causey was looking at her with the expression of a man calculating how much paperwork was about to be generated regardless of what happened next. Thayer listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, You're on maintenance restriction. Yes, sir. That means you're not flying tonight. I understand. I'm going to take this to Colonel Greer. He was already moving. Get me the data. Everything you have. What happened in the next 40 minutes was, in Laya's experience, typical of institutional crisis. A series of short, intense conversations in small rooms, decisions made and unmade, authority asserted and questioned. She sat in the ops center and transferred her Canyon files to the operations server and watched the clock and listened to the fragments of voice traffic she could catch. Bravo 7 had confirmed one soldier down with a chest wound. Chief Nolan Briggs, the team leader, was transmitting in short bursts, calm, professional, the measured voice of a man who had been in bad situations before and was not willing to give the situation the satisfaction of panic. 2 other operators had minor injuries. They were in a defensible position, but not a sustainable one. The enemy element that had picked up their position was probing the perimeter. We need extraction in the next 90 minutes, Briggs transmitted. Reyes is not going to make 2 hours. Bokwatsa hours. Some ski. There was no aircraft response. She sat with that. Reyes is not going to make 2 hours. At 21:47, Causey came back to where she was sitting. His face had a quality she hadn't seen on it before. A tightness around the mouth that wasn't bureaucratic stress, but something else. Greer declined to lift the restriction, he said quietly. Leia looked at him. He says the assessment needs to stand. Can't have it look like... Causey stopped. He said he can't have it look like restrictions get lifted under operational pressure. He's working the helicopter option. The helicopter can't penetrate the Western Corridor in the current storm system. I told you where the window is. I know what you told me. The window is about 58 minutes from now. If there's no aircraft in position... I know. He said it again, and this time there was something underneath it. He looked at her for a long moment. I need to get back to the desk. He walked away. The clock on the wall read 21:49. She sat for 6 more minutes. She thought about Reyes, who she didn't know, who was losing blood somewhere in the dark inside Ashford Canyon. She thought about Chief Briggs transmitting in that measured voice while his team held a perimeter that was slowly compressing around them. She thought about the window, 0215 to 0240, and what would happen if no one was in position to use it. She got up and walked to the flight line. Boom. Her aircraft, or what had been her aircraft, was tail number 781, an A-10C that she had flown for the past 11 months, and knew the way you know the sound of a voice you've been listening to for a long time. She did the pre-flight check in the dark, moving quickly and systematically, checking what needed to be checked. The maintenance restriction was about her flying status, not the aircraft's airworthiness. 781 had been cleared 3 days ago. Her hands found every panel and hatch from memory. The aircraft was cold but intact. She climbed the ladder and settled into the cockpit and started the sequence. Storm 01, this is base operations. Please confirm your authorization code. She keyed her radio. Storm 01 is lifting on personal initiative. I do not have authorization. A pause. Major Vance, you are restricted from flight operations. Please confirm you are standing down. I'm not standing down, she said. I know the canyon. I have a window of approximately 50 minutes, and there is a SEAL operator losing blood on the ground. If someone wants to formally order me to stay, they can do it to my face when I get back. She didn't wait for a response. The A-10's engine spooled up with a sound like industry waking up, a low grinding surge that settled into the familiar twin-jet thrum she'd logged over 3,000 hours with. She taxied onto the runway without tower clearance, which was a thing she had never done before in 15 years of military aviation, and for 1 second the sheer abnormality of it made her hands slightly unsteady on the controls. Then she thought about Reyes. She pushed the throttle forward. The canyon entrance hit her at 0204. From the outside, Ashford Canyon looked like a wound in the mountain, a dark, vertical gash in terrain that was already the color of old bone. She entered at 700 knots and dropped immediately, the walls rising on both sides as the aircraft plunged into the terrain. The storm system was still active in the upper sections, but she was flying the lower corridor, tight to the canyon floor, which was exactly where the official guidance said not to go, and exactly where her own data told her the aircraft would be stable. The wind was bad, but she'd modeled bad. She had modeled this specific kind of bad. The lateral gusts off the southern wall, the pressure differential that created an apparent updraft near the first bend, the false horizon effect that came from the way the walls caught moonlight. She had been through every version of this canyon in simulation dozens of times, and now she was flying the real version, and her hands knew what to do before her brain finished processing the inputs. Storm 01, this is Bravo 7 actual. We're reading your transponder. Is that an A-10? Briggs's voice still measured barely. Bravo 7, this is Storm 01, a 10C unilateral launch. I'm coming in through the western corridor. Give me your position. A beat. You're not supposed to be up here. Correct. Position, please. We're at the base of the shoulder, northeast side. We've got one KIA threat and one DIA critical, gunshot to the chest. We're taking sporadic fire from the ridge above the southern wall. She already knew where that ridge was. She'd labeled it on her map as the overhang, a section of elevated ground that commanded a view down into the corridor, and that she had noted as a vulnerability in her canyon model months ago. She had actually written in her notes, this position would require preemptive suppression in any hot extraction scenario. She adjusted her approach angle. Bravo 7, I'm going to make a pass on the overhang position in about 90 seconds. Keep your heads down. After that, I need to know if you can get your WIA to the canyon floor approximately 400 meters northeast of your current position. A pause. She could hear the calculation happening. We can do that, Briggs said. You've got 10 minutes. She came around the bend and the overhang materialized in her HUD exactly where she'd modeled it. She could see heat signatures. She lined up her strafing run and fired, and the GAU-8 cannon, the reason an A-10 was not technically a fighter, but more accurately a flying gun, did what it was engineered to do, and the enemy position on the overhang went quiet. She came off the strafing run and banked hard and checked her fuel state and felt the aircraft shake around her in a gust that came off the eastern wall unexpectedly, harder than her model had predicted. And for 2 seconds, the nose dropped and the canyon floor came up fast, and she pulled, felt the aircraft respond, felt the wing flex, got the nose back up, and held her altitude with 30 feet of margin below her. Her heart was doing something unusual in her chest. She let it. Storm 01, that's effective. Good shooting, Briggs said. We're moving. Copy. Storm 01 is coming around for overwatch while you move. She set up a racetrack pattern at the lowest safe altitude, circling over the SEAL team's position, watching the ridge lines. The wind was picking up again. She checked the time. 0211. The window opened in 4 minutes and she had helicopters that needed to be in position to use it. She keyed the broader frequency. Base operations, Storm 01. The western corridor is clear. I need the HH-60S in position for extraction immediately. Window opens at 0215, closes approximately 0240. If they're not staged at the canyon mouth by 0213, this doesn't work. Send them now. Static. Then, Storm 01, this is Lieutenant Commander Thayer. Helicopters are spinning up. Get me 5 minutes. You have 4, she said. Make it work. She came around on the north side of her racetrack and saw a muzzle flash on the eastern ridgeline. A new position, not the one she'd suppressed. Somebody had moved. And she adjusted, came in on a lower angle, and took the shot, and the muzzle flash stopped. Her fuel was reading lower than she'd hoped. The unexpected gust had cost her something. She did the math quickly. She had enough to finish the extraction and reach the base with minimal reserve. But minimal reserve was not what you wanted after flying a combat pass in a canyon at night in a storm. Storm 01, Bravo 7. We're at the extraction point. WIA is ambulatory with assistance. We need 3 minutes. Copy Bravo 7. I'll be here. She was aware, doing another circle, that the thing she had predicted for months, the thing she had spent 47 hours studying so that if it ever happened she would know exactly what to do, had arrived. She was also aware that when this was over, she was going to face a reckoning that had nothing to do with the canyon. She thought about Greer's face when she came back. She thought about the paperwork. She circled again. She kept the ridgelines clear. She waited. At 0217, the 2 HH-60S came through the canyon mouth. She guided them in on comms, talking them through the altitude windows, calling out the pressure differential at the bend, giving them the exact flight path she had mapped. They came in with their landing lights cutting through the storm-thinned dark, and they found the SEAL team, and they started loading. Storm 01, first bird is taking passengers. 4 minutes. Copy. She checked fuel. The number was not comfortable. Storm 01 is at bingo +2. I can stay until you're lifted. We'll be clear in 3. She came around on the last leg of her racetrack and felt the aircraft shudder again. Not a gust this time, something in the left engine, a brief fluctuation in the temperature reading that appeared and then disappeared. She noted it. She kept flying. Bravo 7, status? 1 bird away. Second bird loading now, 30 seconds. She watched the first HH-60 pull up and bank north out of the canyon, and something in her chest released that she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Storm 01, Bravo 7, actual. Second bird is away. All personnel extracted. Thank you. A pause, and then, slightly different in register. Whoever you are, thank you. She didn't answer immediately. She was watching her fuel gauge and the left engine temp, and calculating whether what she was feeling in the aircraft was a real fault or a sensor anomaly, and she was thinking about the 43 kilometers of canyon she still had to fly out of. The engine temperature ticked up again. She pushed the throttle on the right engine and began her egress. The canyon walls rose on both sides in the dark, and the weather came back harder as she flew east, and she had to descend twice to hold the corridor, and the left engine was definitely doing something it shouldn't be doing, and she was below her minimum comfortable fuel threshold, and the base was still 40 kilometers out. She flew. She had been flying for a long time, and this was the thing she was best at. The one place where the version of herself that the military had spent 18 months trying to categorize and manage and reduce to a risk profile stopped being a problem and started being a solution. The left engine temperature climbed. She keyed the radio with a voice that was steady because she had decided it was going to be. Base Ops, Storm 01, en route. Left engine showing elevated temp. Possible compressor stall, not confirmed. I have fuel for the return, but margins are thin. Request emergency services on standby when I land. A beat. Then Thayer's voice. Copy Storm 01. Emergency services will be standing by. ETA. She looked at the canyon walls narrowing ahead of her, and the temperature gauge, and the fuel state. 18 minutes, she said. She wasn't entirely sure that was true. 18 minutes was optimistic, and she knew it when she said it. The left engine temperature had climbed 4 degrees in the last 90 seconds, which was not a catastrophic rate, but was not a rate she could ignore either. She was flying the egress corridor at reduced throttle on the left side, compensating with the right, which cost her airspeed, and airspeed was the one thing she could not afford to trade away inside a canyon. The walls were still close. The floor was still dark. The weather had come back with a sullenness that felt personal. She ran the checklist in her head. Not the written one, the one she'd built from experience. The sequence of checks she did when an aircraft started talking to her in a language that wasn't in any manual. Fuel flow on the left side was slightly elevated relative to output. Compressor inlet temperature nominal, exhaust gas temperature creeping. She thought, it's not a stall yet. It might not become one. The A-10 was designed to fly on one engine, and she was not at that point, and she was not going to be at that point if she managed the next 12 minutes correctly. She managed them. Altitude discipline, throttle management, route selection. She flew the eastern egress the same way she had flown the approach, which was with the kind of attention that didn't leave room for anything else. The canyon walls fell away at kilometer 31, and she was over open terrain, and she let out a breath that tasted like copper, and she called base. Storm 01, I'm clear of the canyon. Left engine temp is stabilizing, but I'm watching it. Still requesting emergency standby. Copy, Storm 01, Thayer's voice. We have services staged. You're cleared direct to runway 04. Wind is 170 at 12 knots. Copy, direct 04. She flew the last 9 kilometers with the aircraft in a slight right yaw from the asymmetric power setting and the left engine reading temperatures she did not love, and her fuel state at a number that made the math uncomfortable but not impossible. She could see the base lights when the engine temperature spiked, sudden, significant, a 20-degree jump in 6 seconds. And she heard the compressor note change and felt it in her hands before the warning light came on. Base ops, Storm 01, left engine is going, she said, declaring emergency. Storm 01, emergency acknowledged. You are 8 miles out. Runway in sight? Runway in sight. It was. The lights were there. 2 parallel lines of white in the dark. Storm 01 is single engine, direct approach, no time for pattern. You're cleared, Storm 01. All traffic hold. She shut down the left engine before it could do something worse and trimmed for the asymmetry and flew the straight-in approach on one engine in the dark, with the runway coming up at her and the emergency vehicles rolling into position on both sides and her hands doing what 15 years had trained them to do, which was exactly what was needed and nothing more. The landing was not smooth. The right main gear touched first and the nose swung slightly left before she got the rudder in, and the left main kissed down hard, and she was on the runway, decelerating, the tail hook down as a precaution, and then she was stopped, and the crash trucks were alongside, and she sat in the cockpit for 3 seconds with her hands still on the controls and did not move. Then she reached up and opened the canopy. The air came in cold and smelled like jet exhaust and wet concrete. She pulled off her helmet and sat there while the fire crew checked the left engine nacelle with flashlights. A ground crewman climbed the ladder and looked at her face. "You good, Major?" "Yeah," she said. "I'm good." She was not entirely good. Her hands were shaking slightly now that she'd let them, which was a thing that sometimes happened after the adrenaline found the exit. She noted it clinically, the way she noted most things about her own physiology. It would pass. What would not pass as quickly was what she could already see at the edge of the flight line. Colonel Greer's car, parked with its lights on, and Greer himself standing next to it with his arms folded. A-10. She got the full version in Greer's office at 03:12 in the morning. It wasn't a conversation. It was a performance of institutional authority delivered by a man who was furious and was trying to make the fury look like procedure. He stood behind his desk the entire time, which was a thing people did when they wanted the desk to function as a barrier, and he spoke in the measured cadence of someone composing a report out loud. Unauthorized launch, violation of maintenance restriction, unauthorized use of military aircraft, failure to respond to ground directive, potential negligent damage to government property. That last one a reference to the left engine, which had not yet been assessed. She stood and listened. She had decided on the walk from the flight line to this office that she was not going to argue, not because she thought she was wrong, but because Greer's office at 03:12 in the morning was not the arena where the truth of what had happened was going to be established. This was the arena where someone needed to be visibly angry, and she was the convenient target for it. "Is there anything you want to say?" Greer said finally. "I'd like to know the status of the extracted personnel." His jaw moved. "That's not relevant to this conversation." "With respect, Colonel, it's the only thing relevant to any conversation tonight." He stared at her for a moment. 11 personnel were extracted successfully. 1 WIA is in surgery. "And his prognosis?" "That is not—" He stopped. "Stable. Currently stable." She nodded. She said, "Then I have nothing to add, sir." Greer sat down finally, which seemed to exhaust something in him. He pulled a form from the left side of his desk with the practiced motion of a man who had been building to this. "You're formally suspended pending investigation. Flight status revoked. Not restricted. Revoked. You'll surrender your credentials and your access card tonight." He looked at her across the desk. "I want you to understand that what you did tonight was not heroism. It was insubordination. Whatever happened in that canyon, the outcome does not change the principle." "I understand your position, sir." "Do you?" "Yes." She surrendered her credentials at 0334. She drove to her quarters and sat on the edge of her bed and thought about the left engine temperature and the canyon floor coming up in the dark, and a soldier named Reyes who was currently stable in surgery. She thought about Greer's phrase, "The outcome does not change the principle." She thought, "You are not wrong, and you're completely missing what happened tonight." She was too tired to sleep. She made coffee and sat at her desk and opened her laptop and started writing down everything she'd observed in the canyon. The wind behavior, the thermal anomalies, the spots where her model had been right, and the one spot at kilometer 26 where it had been wrong. She wrote for 2 hours. When she was done, she had 11 pages of notes that were more detailed than anything the base had on file about Ashford Canyon. She saved the file and closed the laptop and finally slept. She was woken at 0847 by a knock at her door that was not tentative. The man outside was not from Kessler. He was wearing a Class A uniform with the shoulder patch of the Special Operations Command and the rank of Lieutenant Colonel, and he had the lean, deliberate quality of someone who had spent a long time in environments where economy of motion was a survival trait. His name tape read OK4. "Major Vance," he said. "I'm Lieutenant Colonel Demi Okafor, SOCOM liaison. I'd like to speak with you." She was still in the clothes she'd fallen asleep in. Her coffee from the night before was still on the desk. She stepped back and let him in because there was no useful alternative. He took the chair she pointed him toward and looked around the room with the neutral assessment of a man cataloging what he saw without assigning it immediate meaning. His eyes stopped on the laptop and the notepad beside it. "You wrote a post-mission report," he said. It wasn't a question. "Notes," she said. "Personal. I'd like to see them." She thought about that for about 3 seconds. Then she turned the laptop around. He read for 5 minutes without speaking. She made fresh coffee because she needed something to do with her hands and because he was clearly going to be there for a while. "You built this data set on your own time," he said. "Yes." "Starting when?" "About 6 months after I arrived at Kessler. The official canyon guidance was inadequate. I wanted to understand the actual behavior." "And you never filed this with operations?" "I filed a request to update the training protocol about 4 months ago. I was told it would be reviewed." "Was it?" "Not as far as I know." Okafor closed the laptop and sat back and looked at her with the expression of a man doing arithmetic. "Chief Briggs asked me to find you," he said. She hadn't expected that. She didn't show it, but she hadn't expected it. "He's out of surgery?" she said. "Briggs didn't need surgery. His man Reyes did. Reyes is out of the ICU this morning." He said it without softening or dramatizing it, just information delivered precisely. "Briggs is aware that an unauthorized A-10 cleared his extraction route, and he wants to know who flew it. I've spent the last 3 hours finding out." She held her coffee and said nothing. "I'm going to tell you what I know," Okafor said. "And then I'm going to tell you what I think. And then you're going to tell me if I'm wrong about any of it." "All right." "You were placed on maintenance restriction based on a report filed by Captain Dowell Strand following the Tanner Ridge exercise. Strand's own performance evaluation from that period includes a failed canyon familiarization sortie that was recorded as a weather abort, but is more accurately described as a decision to turn back early under non-threatening conditions. He had access to your debrief data from the same period, and your performance metrics in the canyon were significantly stronger than his. Whoops. He paused. The restriction was real paperwork submitted through real channels, but the motivation for filing it was not operational safety. The room was quiet. "I'm not wrong," Leia said. It wasn't a question. "No, you're not." He picked up his coffee. "The problem is that none of that changes what you did last night from an administrative standpoint. You violated a standing restriction. You launched without authorization. You used military equipment. I know what I did. Let me finish." He wasn't unkind about it. "You violated those things, and the investigation that Greer has initiated is legitimate, regardless of the circumstances. The system has to process what happened. That's going to take time, and it's going to be uncomfortable." She thought about Greer's phrase again. The outcome does not change the principle. "But," Okafor said. She looked at him. "The outcome does change the conversation. 11 operators extracted, one WIA, who is currently stable because he got out of that canyon in time." He set down his cup. "SOCOM has an interest in what happened last night, and more specifically in the gap that it exposed. An emergency extraction was nearly impossible because the only person with functional knowledge of Ashford Canyon was sitting on the ground under an administratively motivated restriction." What does SOCOM's interest look like, practically speaking? Right now, it looks like me sitting in your quarters at 0900 reading your personal research file. He almost smiled. Not quite. More formally, it's going to look like a request for access to your canyon data, and if the investigation clears you, which I think it will, because the paper trail here is not going to survive scrutiny, a conversation about how your expertise gets used going forward instead of managed away. She sat with that. Outside her window, the flight line was active. She could hear aircraft engines in the distance, the ordinary sounds of a base that had gone back to functioning normally, as if the previous night had been a footnote. "How's Briggs doing?" she said. "Physically, fine. He's the kind of man who processes things by moving, so he spent most of the morning in the gym, and he's now writing his own after-action report, which will be approximately 4 times longer than what's required and twice as detailed." There was something in Okafor's voice that sounded like genuine respect. "He's also, for the record, quite angry." "At me?" "At the situation that made what you did necessary." He stood. "I'm going to need those notes formally. Can you compile them into something transferable?" "I already have. The full file is on my laptop, organized by canyon section, meteorological condition, and altitude band. It's about 240 pages. He stopped. 240. I spent a lot of evenings on it." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she'd learned over the years to recognize. The recalibration that happened when someone encountered evidence that a person they had already categorized needed to be put in a different category entirely. "I'll be in touch," he said. The investigation opened formally at 1400 that same afternoon. Leia was not invited to the opening session, which was standard. The subject of an inquiry didn't sit in while the inquiry was being structured. She knew it was happening because Causey texted her, a 2-word message. It started. She appreciated the message more than she would have expected to. It was the kind of small human thing that happened in institutions sometimes. A person deciding that their small knowledge was worth sharing even when it cost them something. She spent the afternoon the way she always spent time when there was nothing she could directly act on. She organized information. She compiled her canyon data into the formal transfer package Okafor had requested, clean file structure, indexed, with a summary document that explained the methodology. She wrote a separate memo detailing the timeline of the night before, as precisely as she could reconstruct it, every radio call, every decision point, every weather observation. Not a justification document, a record. She was aware that she was doing this partly because it was useful, and partly because doing nothing was not something she was capable of. At 1718, Captain Dowell Strand came to see her. She did not invite him in. They stood in the doorway of her quarters, which was not comfortable but was appropriate given the circumstances. He looked like he hadn't slept, which she noted without satisfaction. He was a reasonably competent pilot who had made a bad decision driven by something smaller than he probably understood about himself. And whatever was happening to him now was a consequence of that, and she wasn't interested in making it worse. "I heard Okafor came to see you," he said. "Yes." He looked at the ground for a moment. He was working on something. She could see it, the way a person works on something they need to say that doesn't want to come out the way they intend it. "The restriction report," he started. "You don't have to do this," she said. "I need to say it." "Strand." She waited until he looked at her. "I know why you filed it." "I think you know why you filed it. The investigation is going to surface the same documentation that Okafor already found, and it's going to be part of the record, and that's probably going to be uncomfortable for you. But I don't need you to come tell me something in a hallway at 1718 to make yourself feel better about it." She said it without heat. "What I need, and what Bravo 7 needed last night, is for the paperwork to reflect what actually happened. If you can contribute to that, contribute. Otherwise, I can," he said. His voice was flat. "Contribute. Then do that." She stepped back and closed the door. The investigation ran for 6 days. The first 2 days were procedural, document collection, witness statements, technical assessment of Tail 781's left engine, which had sustained damage consistent with compressor fatigue and had not been further degraded by her single-engine landing. The maintenance team's preliminary finding was that the engine fault had pre-existed the mission by several days, which opened a separate question about the maintenance inspection process that nobody had expected and that Greer clearly found inconvenient. On the third day, she was called in to give her formal statement. The board was 3 officers, a lieutenant colonel from the judge advocate's office, a senior pilot from a different wing, and a civilian aviation safety specialist who had been brought in because the technical aspects of canyon flying were outside the standard military evaluator's scope. They sat at a long table in the formal conference room, and she sat opposite them, and she answered every question with the same precision she'd used to write the mission notes, factually, completely, without editorializing. They asked about the restriction. She explained the Tanner Ridge incident and what she had filed and what had been on the record. They asked about her unauthorized launch. She explained what she'd known about the window, what the extraction timeline had been, and what the consequence of waiting would have been. They asked about the engine failure. She walked them through the temperature progression and what she'd done in response and when she'd declared the emergency. The civilian aviation specialist, whose name was Dr. Roslyn Four, asked the question nobody else had asked. "How did you develop your knowledge of Ashford Canyon to the level reflected in your dataset?" "I was concerned about the gaps in the official guidance," Leia said, "so I studied it." "On your own time?" "Yes, for approximately 6 months, closer to 8 by the time of the mission." Bayor made a note. She was a small, precise woman in her 50s who moved with the efficiency of someone who had spent decades in rooms where people were trying to obscure technical reality with institutional language, and she was clearly not going to allow that here. "In your assessment," Four said, "would any other pilot currently assigned to Kessler have been able to complete that extraction?" Leia considered the question carefully. "I don't want to characterize my colleagues' abilities. I'm asking for a technical assessment based on your knowledge of the canyon conditions and the training records you'd have been aware of." "Based on the training records I have access to, no, not in those conditions, at night, in that storm system." The room was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," Four said, and made another note. On day 5, Chief Nolan Briggs arrived at Kessler. She didn't know he was coming. She found out when Causey called her at 0920 and said, "There's a SEAL chief in the ops center asking for you by call sign." And she had to stop and remember for a moment that she hadn't told Briggs her name on the radio. She found him near the flight line, standing in the pale morning light with his hands in his jacket pockets, watching the aircraft with the focused attention of a man who was used to assessing what things could do. He was broad-shouldered and not especially tall, and he had the kind of face that had been through enough that it no longer bothered organizing itself into expressions designed for an audience. He turned when he heard her approach. He looked at her for a moment. "Storm 01, he said. "Major Vance," she said. "Briggs." He didn't extend his hand immediately. He was still looking at her, the same way he'd been looking at the aircraft, like he was filing information. Then he put out his hand and she shook it. His grip was firm and brief. "You're shorter than I expected." "People say that?" "Smart people don't." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. "My team wanted to come." "All 11 of them?" 12 originally. Reyes is still in the hospital." He said it evenly. "He asked me to give you something." He reached into his jacket and produced a small folded piece of paper, the kind torn from a notebook, and held it out. She took it and unfolded it. The handwriting was unsteady, probably done from a hospital bed, and it said, "We didn't know your name. We knew you. That's something." Reyes. She folded it again and put it in her pocket and didn't say anything for a moment. "How is he?" she said. "He'll recover." "It'll take time. The chest wound was—" Briggs paused. "He's going to make it, which is the only thing that matters." He looked at the flight line again. "Okafor called me, said the investigation might not go the right way." "The investigation is going to go however it goes." "You're not worried." "I'm worried about a lot of things. Most of them I can't affect, so I focus on the ones I can." She looked at him. "What are you doing here, Chief Briggs?" Not asking the question rudely, genuinely. He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that meant he was deciding how much of the real answer to give. "I spent 8 years trusting that the system puts the right people in the right places at the right times," he said. "And last night, I was in a canyon with a man bleeding out and no aircraft coming, and the system had grounded the one person who could reach us." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I want to look at the person who came anyway." She let that sit. "And?" she said. "And I want to understand how that happens. How someone like you gets managed into a corner while the people who managed you there stay in their chairs." He met her eyes. "Because it almost cost Reyes his life. And I want to know how to stop it from happening to someone else's team." She thought about what to say to that. She thought about Greer and Strand and the 8 months of evenings she'd spent building a data set that nobody had asked for, and Okafor reading her laptop in her quarters at 9 in the morning, and For's precise handwriting taking notes she hadn't been able to read. "The investigation has 5 more witnesses scheduled," she said finally. "Some of them are going to say things that complicate the official version of events. My guess is that it's going to be hard to close cleanly. And after that? I don't know. I've been trying not to build too much on a foundation that hasn't been laid yet." Briggs looked at her for a moment with the steady regard of a man who had assessed a lot of situations and was comfortable with complicated ones. "Okafor is going to push for a formal review of the restriction process," he said, "and I'm going to support that, formally, in writing, with the full weight of what happened in that canyon attached to it." She hadn't known that. She absorbed it without showing what it cost her to hear it. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know I don't." He said it simply. "That's the point." They stood on the flight line a little longer in the thin morning light, while aircraft moved in and out and the base went about its business around them. She thought about the canyon, the walls, the wind, the way the corridor had narrowed and she'd held altitude and done the math and kept flying. She thought about Reyes's note in her pocket and the unsteady handwriting. "We didn't know your name. We knew you." She was turning that over in her mind when Causey came across the flight line toward her with a walk that was slightly too purposeful to be casual, and she saw the expression on his face and understood before he spoke that something had changed. "The board wants to reconvene," he said. "Fowler requested additional testimony. There's someone from the JAG office asking about Strand's original report." He stopped in front of her, slightly out of breath. "And Colonel Greer has requested to be present for the next session." Briggs glanced at her. "Greer requested to be present," he said carefully, "or was requested to be present." Causey looked between them. "Both, I think." The language in the notification was, they used the word required. The flight line noise continued around them. engines and wind and the ordinary sounds of a military installation that had no idea what was moving underneath its surface, and Leia stood in it and thought, now it starts. The reconvened session was scheduled for 1400, which gave Leia 4 hours to do nothing useful. She spent the first hour walking the perimeter road that ran along the eastern edge of the base, a 3-kilometer loop she used when she needed to think without sitting still. Briggs had gone back to the operations building to meet with Okafor, and she'd watched him go with the particular feeling of someone who had been handed something they hadn't asked for and wasn't sure yet how to carry it. His offer of formal support meant something real. SOCOM's written account of what had happened in that canyon would carry weight that her own testimony couldn't, and she understood that, and she was not too proud to understand it. But it also meant the investigation was becoming something larger than a base-level administrative proceeding, and larger things had more surfaces for things to go wrong on. She walked. The morning was cold and overcast, the kind of sky that sat low and gray without doing anything decisive about it. She thought about Faur's request for additional testimony. She thought about the JAG inquiry into Strand's original report. She thought about Greer being required to be present, and what that specific word, required, meant in the context of a formal aviation safety board. She thought about the 11 pages of notes she'd written in the hours after the mission, while she was too wired to sleep. She had been precise about one thing in particular, the moment at kilometer 26 where her model had been wrong. The wind had come off the eastern wall harder than she'd predicted, and the nose had dropped, and she'd had 30 feet of margin below her before she recovered it. She had written that down exactly as it happened because accuracy mattered more than how it reflected on her, and she had included it in the formal file she'd given Okafor. Most people, she thought, would have left that part out. She had not, because the margin was real data, and real data about where the model failed was more useful than a clean-looking file that papered over the gap. If someone flew that canyon again under similar conditions, they needed to know about kilometer 26. That was the thing nobody who managed her seemed to understand about how she operated. She wasn't reckless. She was precise about risk in a way that required knowing where the actual edges were, not where the institutional guidelines assumed them to be. Those were different things. The gap between them was where Bravo 7 had nearly died. She finished the loop and went back to her quarters and ate something from her refrigerator that tasted like obligation, and then she put on her dress uniform and drove to the formal conference building. The room had changed configuration. When she'd given her statement on day 3, the board had been 3 people at a long table and she had been opposite them. Now the table had been extended and there were 6 chairs on the board side. Faur was there, in the same seat as before, with a thicker folder in front of her. The JAG lieutenant colonel, whose name was Brennan, sat at the end. 2 new faces, both in uniform, both senior enough that their rank insignia communicated authority before anyone spoke. And Colonel Greer, at the near end of the table, with the carefully neutral expression of a man who had been told to sit in a chair and was experiencing that as an act of violence. The 6th chair had Okafor in it. He caught her eye briefly when she sat down. Nothing communicative in his expression, just acknowledgement that they were both in the room. The board chair, the senior JAG officer, opened by explaining that the scope of the inquiry had been expanded to include a systemic review of the restriction process and the canyon operational readiness assessment. The language was formal and procedural, and she listened to all of it and kept her face still. Then Faur opened her folder. What followed was 2 hours of testimony that felt, from Leia's position, like watching a structure being disassembled from the outside, carefully, methodically, with the specific tools required for each component. Faur had done additional work in the 3 days since the first session. She had pulled the meteorological data from the night of the mission and cross-referenced it against Leia's canyon model, and her analysis showed a correlation coefficient that she described in technical language and then translated, flatly, as the model was accurate to within 8% across all measured parameters except one location at kilometer 26 where it underestimated lateral wind velocity. The subject's own post-mission notes flagged that discrepancy, Faur said. She identified it and included it in the formal data transfer. That's not a characteristic of reckless decision-making. That's the characteristic of someone doing rigorous work. Greer's expression didn't change. That was its own kind of expression. Brennan, the JAG officer, addressed Leia directly. Major Vance, in your assessment, was the maintenance restriction filed against you procedurally valid at the time of filing? She had prepared for this question. She had also decided, well before she walked into this room, how she was going to answer it, completely and without softening, because anything less would undermine the rest of what she'd said. The paperwork was procedurally complete, she said. The grounds cited, the Tanner Ridge deviation, were real events that were documented. The report was filed through the correct channels and signed by an authorized officer. But the Tanner Ridge deviation was a documented safety response that I filed a full account of within 2 hours, and the account was never challenged. If the restriction had been filed because the deviation itself was considered unsafe, I would have expected a review of my account. No review was requested. She kept her voice even. What changed between the Tanner Ridge incident and the restriction filing was Captain Strand's access to my Canyon performance data. Brennan made a note. You're alleging that the restriction was filed in response to a perceived performance comparison rather than a genuine safety concern. I'm describing a timeline, she said. The interpretation is the board's to make. Okafor spoke for the first time, to the board rather than to her. SOCOM's interest in this proceeding is specifically in the systemic gap that the timeline reveals, not whether any individual acted with malicious intent. Intent is harder to establish and less operationally useful. The gap is this. A pilot with demonstrably superior specialized knowledge of a high-risk terrain feature was placed on administrative restriction during a period when that knowledge became mission-critical. The mechanism that allowed that to happen is what we need to understand. Greer said, the restriction was filed and approved through standard process. If the process has gaps, that's a separate conversation from, Colonel. Brennan's voice was not unkind, but was final. You'll have the opportunity to speak when we get to your section of the testimony. Greer's section of the testimony began 40 minutes later and ran for 90 minutes and was, from Leia's observation, genuinely uncomfortable for everyone present, including Greer himself. Brennan asked him about the decision to deny the restriction lift on the night of the mission. He asked about the operational assessment process that had placed the canyon within helicopter limitations under the current storm system, an assessment that had not incorporated Leia's meteorological data, which had been in the operations system since she'd transferred it to Thayer several hours earlier. Were you aware that Major Vance's canyon data was in the operations system at the time you made the decision not to lift the restriction? Brennan asked. A pause. Small, but real. I was aware there was data, Greer said. I hadn't reviewed it. It had been in the system for approximately 3 hours at that point. Yes. And the operational assessment that determined the canyon was not penetrable by available aircraft under current conditions. That assessment also did not incorporate Major Vance's data. The assessment was made by qualified aviation officers using available to them, yes. Ford's voice was quiet. The question is whether the most accurate available information was used. Based on my review, it was not. The room was quiet. Greer said in a voice that was doing a lot of work to stay level. I made the decision I believed was correct based on the information I had reviewed. Nobody said anything to that for a moment. Then Okafor said, quietly, That's the problem, Colonel. Bob. Leia was released from the formal session at 16:38. She walked out of the conference building into the gray afternoon and stood on the steps for a moment, recalibrating. Kazi was waiting near the parking lot, which she hadn't expected. How did it go? He said. It went, she said. Four spent 2 hours this morning reviewing the engine maintenance logs on 7818, he said. The compressor fatigue she found, it predates the mission by at least 4 days, which means the aircraft was already developing a fault during normal maintenance cycle. She thought about that. So the restriction was keeping me off an aircraft with a developing mechanical fault that the maintenance process hadn't flagged. That's one way to read it. That's not great for anyone's paperwork. No, he agreed. It's not. She looked at the sky. The gray had thickened and there was weather moving in from the northwest, the kind that took its time arriving but committed once it did. Briggs still on base? She said. He's meeting with Okafor in the SOCOM coordination cell. Has been for about 2 hours. She thought about what that meeting might look like. Briggs's meticulous after-action account being folded into whatever formal recommendation Okafor was building. She thought about Reyes's note in her pocket, which she'd transferred to the inside breast pocket of her dress jacket that morning without fully deciding to. She thought about the investigation and the engine logs and Fowler's correlation coefficient and the word Brennan had used, systemic, and what it would mean if the board used that word in its findings. "Go home," she told Causey. "You've been here since 600. So have you. I don't count." He looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone deciding whether to say the thing they were thinking. "You should eat something," he said. "Real food, not whatever's in your refrigerator." "My refrigerator is fine." "It's not. I've seen the inside of it." He walked to his car. "There's a decent diner about 2 miles south of the East Gate. They're open until 2200. She watched him go. Then she went back inside and worked in the empty conference room for another hour, reviewing the files she'd been given access to as part of her formal testimony. The documented timeline, the maintenance records, the meteorological assessment from the night of the mission. She read all of it with the same attention she gave to canyon data, looking for the places where the official record diverged from what she knew had happened. There were 4 of them. She wrote them down. The diner was exactly what Causey had described, and she ordered coffee and eggs that came with toast she didn't ask for and sat in a booth by the window and looked at the parking lot and thought about nothing specific for about 20 minutes, which was as close as she got to rest when her mind was running the way it was running. The booth across from her was occupied by a family, a woman in her 30s and 2 children, a girl of about 7 and a boy younger than that, and the children were eating pancakes with the focused intensity of people doing something very important. The woman was on her phone, intermittently, in the way of someone who was trying to be present but had something she was waiting to hear about. Leia watched them without meaning to, and then looked away because it felt intrusive. She was on her second coffee when her phone rang. The number was Okafor's. "The board is going to issue a preliminary finding tomorrow morning," he said without preamble. "They're not waiting for the full formal timeline. Fire pushed for it. She says the technical picture is clear enough that a delay serves no one." "What's in the preliminary finding?" "I don't know the exact language. What I know is that Brennan spent 45 minutes after the session reviewing the maintenance fault documentation and the meteorological assessment gap, and he came out of that room looking like a man who had made a decision." That could mean several things. It could, but I've been in a lot of rooms with JAG officers, and I know what it looks like when they're building toward exoneration versus building toward discipline. This looked like the first thing. A pause. "It's not certain. I want to be clear about that." "I understand." Briggs submitted his formal after-action statement this afternoon, 12 pages. He included a specific section on the operational intelligence gap. His words, created by the restriction. Another pause, shorter. He also, separately, filed a formal commendation request through SOCOM channels. "For you." She was quiet for a moment. "He didn't tell me he was going to do that," she said. "Would you have tried to talk him out of it?" She thought about that honestly. "Probably not, but I would have asked him to wait until the investigation closed." "He knows what he's doing," Okafor said. "He's been here before. Not this specific situation, but the shape of it. The version where someone does the right thing and the institution needs time to catch up with that fact. He's been on the receiving end of that kind of wait." She thought about what that meant for Briggs, what it cost a man like that to wait for an institution to catch up. She thought it probably cost more than he let on. "I'm going to give you some information I'm not formally supposed to share yet," Okafor said, "because I think you should have it. And because I think you've earned the right to one less surprise." "All right." "General Kowalski is going to be briefed on this case tomorrow morning before the preliminary finding is released." He let that land. He asked to be. Brigitte Kowalski commanded the air component of the Special Operations Theater. She was 3 levels above Greer and was the kind of general who had not gotten to her position by being uninvested in operational failures. The fact that she had asked to be briefed before the finding was released meant that someone, at some point in the past 3 days, had considered this case important enough to bring to her attention. "Why?" Leia said. "Because the extraction that night involved SOCOM personnel. and because the circumstances that nearly prevented it have implications she considers relevant to her command. Okafor's voice was measured. She's going to have questions. Some of them will be about you specifically. I want you prepared for the possibility that this conversation goes beyond the investigation. She looked at the window. The weather front was moving faster than she'd expected. The parking lot was starting to glisten. What kind of beyond? She said. The kind that involves your expertise being used in a different way than it has been. He paused. I can't say more than that tonight. Understood. Get some sleep. Tomorrow is going to be long. She put the phone down and looked at her eggs, which had gone cold. The family across the booth was finishing up. The girl had syrup on her sleeve and was not concerned about it, and the boy had fallen asleep against the window, his cheek pressed to the glass. The woman was watching them with an expression that was tired and something else, something harder to name, the expression of someone holding on to the exact right thing even when holding was hard. Leia paid her bill and drove back to base. Woke. The preliminary finding was delivered at 09:30 the following morning to all parties simultaneously, which meant Leia read it in her quarters off a secure document link while sitting at her desk with a coffee that was still hot. It was 11 pages. She read it the way she read everything, twice, methodically, picking out the specific language. The finding on the restriction was unambiguous. The operational safety basis for the maintenance restriction filed against Major Vance was not adequately supported by the documented evidence and appears to have been influenced by factors outside the stated safety rationale. The finding on her unauthorized launch was more complex. It acknowledged the violation clearly, noted the circumstances, and concluded that the violation represented an extraordinary response to an extraordinary operational gap, and recommended that the formal disciplinary record reflect the circumstances in full rather than treat the violation in isolation. The finding on Tail 781's engine was the one she hadn't expected to carry as much weight as it did. The maintenance fault had predated the restriction, and the formal maintenance inspection process had not flagged it. The finding noted that the aircraft had been flown by 2 other pilots in the days before Leia's mission without the fault being identified, and that the fault had progressed to near failure during the mission. The language was careful, but the implication was not. The final section was titled Systemic Recommendations, and it was 3 pages long. She was on page 2 of that section when her phone rang. The number on the screen was one she didn't recognize, with an area code she associated with the SOCOM headquarters building. She answered. Major Vance? The voice was direct, unhurried, and carried the specific quality of someone who had not needed to introduce themselves by title for a long time. This is General Kowalski. I've read the preliminary finding. I'd like to speak with you this afternoon. Leia straightened without deciding to. Yes, ma'am. Not formally, not a board session, a conversation. A brief pause. I have some questions about your canyon data that I don't think anyone else has thought to ask yet. I'm available at your convenience, General. 1500. I'll be at Kessler by 14:30. Okafor will send you a location. Another pause, shorter. One more thing, Major. Ma'am. The section of your post-mission notes where you document the kilometer 26 discrepancy. The part where the model was wrong. Kowalski's voice was even, but there was something behind it that Leia was trying to read and couldn't quite. That section is the reason I asked to see this file. Not the canyon flying, not the extraction. That section. Leia thought about what to say and settled on the truth. I included it because it was accurate. I know you did, Kowalski said. That's what I want to talk about. The call ended. Leia set the phone on the desk and looked at the remaining page and a half of the Systemic Recommendations section, which she had not yet finished reading. She picked up the document and read to the end, and when she was done, she sat with it for a moment. The final recommendation read, The command structure should evaluate the feasibility of a dedicated specialized terrain intelligence program, utilizing personnel with demonstrated high-level knowledge of operationally relevant terrain features, with the authority to apply that knowledge in time-critical extraction scenarios. She read it a second time. It was formal language doing a lot of work to describe something that, translated simply, meant, this should never happen again, and here is one way to make sure it doesn't. She set the document down. She had 40 minutes before she needed to prepare for the 1500 meeting. She used them to update her canyon notes with 2 observations she'd been carrying since the night of the mission and hadn't yet committed to paper. A wind behavior pattern she'd noticed on the egress that suggested her model needed refinement at the canyon exit point, and a thought about altitude thresholds during active storm conditions that she'd been turning over since she'd landed. She was halfway through the second observation when her door opened without a knock. Greer stood in the doorway. He was in his service uniform, and he looked like a man who had spent the last 12 hours in a version of the canyon that had no exits, and he looked at her across the small room with an expression that had moved past anger into something more complicated and less legible. She waited. "The preliminary finding," he said. "I read it. I want you to understand." He stopped, started again. "I made decisions that I believed were operationally sound. The restriction, the night of the extraction. I was working from the information I had reviewed. I know that. That doesn't make the outcome acceptable." He said it like it cost him something. "I know that too." She looked at him for a moment. He was not a villain. She had never thought of him as one, even in the worst of it. He was a man who had done mediocre things for understandable reasons, and had not thought clearly about the consequences until the consequences had a name and a chest wound and were currently recovering in a military hospital. "What happens to you next is the board's determination," she said. "Not mine." "I know." He was quiet for a beat. "Kowalski is coming." "Yes." He looked at her with something she couldn't entirely read, and then he nodded, once, and left. She turned back to her notes and finished the second observation and saved the file. At 13:47, Okafor's message came through with the location for the 1500 meeting. The SOCOM Coordination Cell, Conference Room B. She was reviewing her canyon file one more time. Not because she needed to review it, but because the habit of preparation was the one thing she trusted more than anything else. When her phone rang again. Unknown number, different area code this time. She answered. A voice she didn't know said, "Major Vance, this is Captain Ardell, medical staff at Landstrom Military Medical. I'm calling because a patient named Reyes listed you as a requested contact. He's been asking whether anyone told you." The captain paused. "He wanted you to know his surgery went well and that he's been walking the corridor this morning. He said you'd understand why that matters." She sat with that for a moment. "Tell him I understand," she said. "Tell him I'm glad he's walking." She ended the call and sat in the quiet of her quarters, and outside the window the weather that had moved in overnight was doing something decisive finally. Hard, steady rain coming down on the flight line, on the parked aircraft, on the canyon northwest of the base that she had mapped for 8 months and flown in the dark and nearly not come home from. She thought about kilometer 26, 30 feet of margin, the nose dropping and her hands finding the input before the thought was finished. She had included that in the notes. She had included it exactly. And at 14:58, she closed her laptop, straightened her jacket, and walked out into the rain toward whatever came next, and found, waiting at the entrance to the SOCOM building, not Okafor, but Briggs, standing with his collar turned up against the weather, holding a door open, looking at her with the steady regard she had come to recognize as simply how he looked at things he took seriously. "She's already inside," he said. "You're here for this?" Leia said. "Kowalski asked me to be." He held the door. "She wants to hear what the canyon looked like from the ground while you describe it from the air." She stepped through the door and the rain stopped and the fluorescent light of the corridor was sharp and clean. And at the end of the hall, the door to Conference Room B was open, and through it she could see a woman in a general's uniform standing with her back to the door, looking at the topographic display on the wall, Ashford Canyon, rendered in contour lines, the western corridor running its length like a scar. And Leia recognized something in the quality of that attention. The forward lean of someone who was looking at a problem and already thinking about what it would take to solve it. Briggs let the door close behind them. Their footsteps were quiet on the corridor floor. The general did not turn yet. Okafor stepped out from a side room and handed Leia a thin folder. She glanced at the cover sheet and her hand went still. The title read, Preliminary Program Framework, Specialized Terrain Intelligence and Rapid Response Authority. Below that, a single line, Draft for review. Major L. Vance, designated lead consultant. She looked at Okafor. He said very quietly, "She wrote that before she left headquarters this morning." And the general turned. General Kowalski was shorter than the uniform implied. That was Laya's first observation. Not the rank insignia, not the ribbons, not the composed authority of a woman who had spent 30 years earning the right to stand the way she stood. She was maybe 5'4", with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of face that had done a lot of weather, and she looked at Laya across the conference room with eyes that were doing rapid, thorough work. "Major Vance," she said. Not a greeting exactly, more like a confirmation. "General?" Kowalski looked at the folder in Laya's hands, the one Okafor had just given her, the one with her name on the cover sheet, and then looked back at her face, and Leia understood that the general had wanted to see that specific moment, the moment of reading her own name on that document, and had arranged the room accordingly. "Sit down," Kowalski said, "both of you." The four of them settled around the near end of the conference table. Kowalski at the head, Briggs to her left, Okafor across from him, Leia at the end. The topographic display of Ashford Canyon was still on the wall behind the general. Nobody had turned it off, and Leia didn't think that was accidental. "I'm going to tell you what I know," Kowalski said, which was, Leia noted, exactly what Okafor had said to her 3 days ago in her quarters. She wondered if they'd compared notes, or if it was simply how people in their position opened difficult conversations. "And then I'm going to ask you some questions. And I want direct answers, not careful ones." "Yes, ma'am." "The preliminary finding is accurate. The restriction should not have been filed on those grounds, and the operational assessment that night was working from incomplete information. Both of those things are true, and both of them are going to have formal consequences." Kowalski's voice was steady and did not editorialize. "What I'm more interested in this afternoon is the thing that the preliminary finding describes in procedural language, but doesn't fully address. The gap." She paused. "Not the gap between what Greer knew and what you knew. The larger gap. The structural one." Leia waited. "Walk me through the canyon," Kowalski said. "Not what's in the data file, the file I've read. Tell me what the data file doesn't capture." It was not the question Leia had expected, which meant it was probably the right question. She turned to the topographic display and stood and began to talk. She talked for 40 minutes, and in that 40 minutes she described Ashford Canyon the way she had come to understand it. Not as a static terrain feature, but as a dynamic system, a place that behaved differently depending on temperature, time of day, season, precipitation, wind direction, and a dozen variables that interacted in ways that weren't linear and couldn't be reduced to a flight manual entry. She talked about the thermal behavior at the shoulder, the compression zone, the specific altitude windows that opened and closed depending on conditions. She talked about kilometer 26 and what had happened there, and why it had happened, and what the model needed to account for, that it currently didn't. Briggs sat with his arms on the table and listened with the focused stillness of someone cross-referencing what he was hearing against his own experience of the same terrain from the ground. Twice he asked questions, short, specific, about the elevation relationship between the extraction point and the eastern ridgeline, and she answered them and incorporated his ground-level observations into what she was describing, and felt the model get slightly more accurate in real time. Kowalski asked 3 questions total. Each one landed in a gap Leia hadn't realized she'd left. When she finished, she sat back down. Kowalski looked at the display for a moment. Then she said, "How many other terrain features in our operational theater have the same problem, the same gap between the official guidance and the actual behavior?" Leia thought about it honestly. "I don't know. I've studied Ashford Canyon specifically because it's the one I fly near and the one where the official guidance seemed most inadequate. I don't have data on other features. But the problem, the methodology problem, the gap between static guidance and dynamic reality, that's not specific to this canyon." "No, ma'am. It's a general problem with how terrain intelligence gets built and updated. The guidance is written once, usually under average conditions, and then it doesn't get revised until something goes wrong. Until someone nearly dies." "Yes." Kowalski nodded slowly. the nod of someone filing information into a structure they're already building. The draft framework Okafor gave you. Read page 4. Leia opened the folder and found page 4. It described a proposed pilot program, and she noted the word pilot being used in both its senses simultaneously, which might have been intentional, for terrain intelligence specialization. The program would identify personnel with demonstrated expertise in specific high-risk terrain features and formalize that expertise within the command structure, giving those personnel rapid response authority for extraction scenarios involving their terrain. Page 4 described the scope of the initial program. It listed one terrain feature as the starting point, Ashford Canyon. The framework is in draft, Kowalski said. It needs work. The authority structures are rough, the integration with existing extraction protocols isn't fully developed, and there are 3 places where the language will create jurisdictional problems if it goes to formal review as written. She looked at Leia. Which is why I want the person who understands the problem to help fix the framework before it becomes policy. Leia set the folder down. You want me to work on the program design. I want you to lead it. There's a difference. Kowalski's voice was matter-of-fact. You're not a consultant on someone else's project. You're the subject matter expert, and you're going to have the authority that goes with that, which means when someone in the command structure wants to manage your input sideways into a less inconvenient shape, they're going to need a better reason than they've had so far. The room was quiet for a moment. Briggs said, without particular emphasis, "That's how it should have been from the start." "Yes," Kowalski said. "It should have been." She looked at Leia with the direct appraisal that had been in her eyes since Leia walked through the door. "I'm not offering you this because of what happened in the canyon," she said. "I'm offering it because of what you did before the canyon. The 8 months. The 240 pages. The fact that when your model was wrong by 30 feet, you wrote it down exactly." She paused. "The canyon flying was impressive. The documentation is what changes policy." Leia thought about what to say and found that there wasn't much. Not because she was overwhelmed. She was tired and precise and operating on inadequate sleep, and she was not going to perform emotion she wasn't feeling, but because the general had said the thing correctly, and adding to it would be padding. "I'll need flight status restored," she said. "That's in the preliminary finding. And access to the full operations meteorological archive, not just the canyon section. Okafor will arrange it. And the framework document needs a co-author who understands extraction protocols from the ground level, not just the air side." She looked at Briggs. "If Chief Briggs is available." Briggs looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration of the same kind Okafor had shown in her quarters 3 days ago. "I can make time," he said. Kowalski almost smiled, the same almost as before. "Then we have a starting point," she said. The formal consequences for Greer and Strand arrived in the way formal consequences usually arrived in military institutions, procedurally, specifically, and without theater. Greer received a letter of reprimand for the operational assessment failure, specifically for failing to integrate available intelligence data into the extraction decision on the night of the mission. It was not the end of his career, but it was the kind of mark that followed a file and changed the shape of what came after. He was also removed from oversight of the Canyon Operational Readiness Assessment, and that oversight was reassigned to a working group that reported directly to the wing commander rather than through the squadron chain. Strand's situation was more complicated because the board had to find language for something that was technically within the rules, but clearly operating against their spirit. The restriction had been filed procedurally correctly. The motivation for filing it was documented, but motivation was difficult to attach formal consequence to in the way a direct policy violation was. What Brennan ultimately wrote in the formal finding was a directed counseling entry, not a reprimand, but a formal notation in Strand's file that the restriction filing had been found to be influenced by factors outside the stated safety rationale, and that this represented a failure of professional judgment that would be monitored going forward. Leia read both documents when they were released. She read them once, carefully, and then she put them in a folder and turned back to the framework draft she was working on, because the consequences were the board's work, and the framework was hers, And the second thing was what she could actually affect going forward. She was aware that what the board had given Strand was less than what the situation deserved. The counseling entry was real, and it would follow his file. But it was not the weight that Briggs's commendation for her would carry, and it was not the visibility of what Greer faced. She thought about this and decided, after sitting with it for a day, that she was not going to spend the time she had on the question of whether the consequences were proportional. They were what they were. What she could do was make sure the system that had allowed the situation to develop was harder to abuse going forward, and that was what the framework was for. She worked on the framework in the evenings after the formal investigation sessions wound down, in the same way she had worked on the Canyon data, systematically, without waiting for permission, building something that was going to be more complete than what anyone had asked for. Briggs came to her quarters 2 evenings in a row to work on the ground-level extraction protocol integration. He sat across her desk, and they worked through the problem the way two people work through a problem when they both understand it well from different angles, and neither of them is interested in making the process more complicated than it needs to be. He was direct about what he didn't know, and she was direct about what she didn't know, and the places where their knowledge overlapped were productive, and the places where it didn't were instructive in a different way. On the second evening, he brought coffee, which she appreciated without making anything of it. Reyes is being transferred to the outpatient program next week, he said. He was reading the extraction protocol section she'd written while she worked on the authority structure. He's going to do the rehab at Landstrom, and then he's talking about coming back to the team. Timeline? 6 months minimum. Probably closer to 9. He turned a page. He asked about you again. He doesn't need to keep checking in. I don't think he's checking in, Briggs said. I think he's working something out. She looked up from her screen. He had a lot of time in the ICU to think about the fact that there was a window where nobody was coming, Briggs said. And then somebody was. And he's trying to understand what that means in a larger sense. He set the pages down. People do that after something like this. And what do you tell him? I tell him the true thing, which is that the person who came didn't come because the system worked. She came because she understood something the system didn't and made a choice the system wouldn't. He looked at her. And I tell him that's worth understanding, not just being grateful for. She thought about that and found she didn't have a clean response to it, which was unusual for her. This section on authority escalation, she said, redirecting, I think we need a different trigger threshold. The current language requires 2 command approvals before a terrain specialist can launch in a time-critical extraction scenario, which is the same problem restated in different language. Briggs picked the pages back up. 1 approval with a mandatory debrief afterward? And a defined time window. If the approval isn't received within... She thought about the timeline from the night of the mission. 12 minutes of a formal request, the specialist has unilateral authority for a defined scope of action. He read the section with her proposed change in mind and nodded slowly. That'll get pushback from the command structure people. Yes. Kowalski will back it. That's why I'm writing it down before the pushback happens, she said. He almost laughed. Not quite, but almost. The formal investigation closed on the 9th day with a full finding that incorporated the preliminary document and added 3 additional sections based on testimony collected in the final sessions. Leia was present for the formal release briefing, which was held in the same conference room where the expanded board had convened, and which had a different population this time, more senior, more from outside the base, more people who had been sent to understand what had happened and carry that understanding back to wherever they came from. The finding ran to 41 pages. The systemic recommendations section had been expanded from 3 pages to 7. The language on the terrain intelligence program was no longer preliminary. It was a formal recommendation with a named lead and a 6-month implementation timeline. She heard her name read aloud in that room and did not change her expression because the work was what mattered and the work was already begun, and the reading of her name was a formality that would not have been possible if she'd done things differently in the months before anyone was paying attention. What she was not prepared for was what happened after the formal release. The briefing ended and people began to move around the room in the way they do when a formal proceeding becomes a reception, and she was talking to Farr about the methodology for updating terrain intelligence protocols when Greer appeared at her periphery. He stood at the edge of the room near the door with his coffee and looked like a man who had made a decision about something and was going to carry it through before he thought better of it. She excused herself from Fora and walked over. He looked at her for a moment with the complicated expression she'd been watching move through various stages for the past 9 days, from anger to defensiveness to something that had finally arrived somewhere she recognized as honest. "The commendation that Briggs filed," he said. "I added a supporting notation to it this morning." She hadn't known that. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know." He looked at his coffee. "The framework document. I read the draft that Okafor circulated." He paused. "The 12-minute window for specialist unilateral authority." "Yes. It's going to be difficult to get through the formal approval process." "I know that. If you need someone who understands where the resistance is likely to come from in the command structure," he said, "I know that landscape better than most people in this room." He met her eyes. "I'm not asking for anything. I'm saying the knowledge is available if it's useful." She studied him for a moment. He was not comfortable. He was doing a thing that cost him something and was doing it anyway, which was more than she'd expected and was probably as close as he was going to get to the thing he actually wanted to say, which was that he had contributed to a situation that could have killed people, and he understood that and was trying to find a way to put that understanding to use. "I'll be in touch," she said. She walked back toward 4 and felt the conversation settle behind her into something that was not resolved but was different from what it had been. And different was what was available. And she was practical enough to take what was available. 3 days after the formal finding closed, Strand came to see her. Not in a hallway this time. He sent a formal meeting request through the base calendar system, which she found notable. The deliberateness of it, the use of a channel that created a record. She accepted it, and they sat in the small conference room adjacent to the ops center, the same room where she'd read her restriction paperwork on the day this had started. He looked like the 9 days had done something to him that wasn't simply stress. She'd seen people carry guilt before. It sat differently than shame, which was about exposure, and differently from regret, which was about outcome. Guilt was about the knowledge of what you'd chosen when you'd had the option not to. He looked like a man who'd had a lot of time with that specific knowledge. "I filed a written account with the board," he said. "Voluntary, detailing my access to your performance data and the timeline of the restriction filing." She hadn't known that either. "When?" "Day 6. Brennan didn't require it. I went in and gave it anyway." She was quiet for a moment. "The counseling entry is accurate," he said. "What I did was a failure of professional judgment. The language is right. I filed that restriction because I was threatened by what your data said about the difference between your capability and mine, and I used a real procedural mechanism to act on a small impulse, and that small impulse ended up inside a chain of events that put 12 people in a canyon with no aircraft." He said it flatly, not performing contrition, just stating it. "I want you to know that I understand that chain." She thought about what to say. The clean response would be something generous, acknowledgement. Maybe some version of absolution. But she didn't think that was what he was actually here for. He wasn't here to be forgiven. He was here to say the true thing out loud to the person it most needed to be said to, and she understood that, so she did the thing that was actually useful. "The formal record reflects it," she said. "What you filed, what the board found, that's what exists going forward." He nodded. "The framework program," she said. "When it goes to formal approval, there will be a review period where command is looking for objections. One of the objections that's going to come up is that unilateral specialist authority creates inconsistency in command structure. That objection is going to need a rebuttal that understands the command structure argument from the inside." She looked at him. "If you want to contribute something useful to this, that's where the work is." He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. "That's a real offer," he said, slightly uncertain, like he was checking. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. "I can do that." She walked him out and stood in the corridor watching him go, and thought about what it cost a person to build something useful out of the worst version of themselves. It wasn't nothing, it didn't balance the ledger, but it was real work, and real work was what she respected, and she was going to keep respecting it consistently, regardless of who was doing it. The framework went to its first formal review 14 days after the investigation closed. The review board was composed of 7 officers, 3 of whom Leia had never met, and 2 of whom she recognized from the operational side of the theater command as people who had strong opinions about authority structure and were not predisposed to find those opinions wrong. The session was scheduled for 3 hours and ran to 5. She presented the framework herself, section by section, with Briggs present for the extraction protocol portion and Okafor for the command integration section. She had anticipated every objection that materialized and several that didn't, and she answered them with the same directness she used for everything, and where she didn't have a complete answer, she said so and offered the data that was adjacent to a complete answer and let the board understand why the gap existed and what it would take to close it. The 12-minute unilateral authority window drew the most sustained pushback, which she'd expected. The objections were legitimate ones, so not petty obstruction, but genuine concern about precedent and command consistency. And she'd written the rebuttal section of the document with those specific concerns in mind. Strand's contribution was in the command structure analysis, which was precise and internally consistent, and which Brennan, sitting at the end of the review table, read with careful attention. At the 4-hour mark, one of the officers she hadn't met, a colonel named Vasks from the Air Component Headquarters, pushed back on the program scope. He thought the terrain intelligence model was sound, but the specialist authority structure was too narrow, applicable only to designated personnel, rather than building the methodology into the broader pilot training framework. She hadn't expected that particular objection because it wasn't an objection. It was an expansion. "You're saying the methodology should be teachable," she said. "I'm saying it already is," Vask said. "You taught it. You just did it alone in your quarters for 8 months. If the program design includes a training component that develops this methodology in other pilots for other terrain features, you're not building a workaround for a gap. You're closing the gap." She looked at him across the table. "That would require a curriculum development component," she said. "Yes. And training resources and a designated training authority and an assessment framework for certifying terrain specialists." "Yes." He looked at her steadily. "Can you build that?" She thought about it honestly. "Not alone." "You weren't planning to do this alone anyway," he said, with a glance at Briggs. She looked at the document in front of her, the draft that had started as 3 rough pages and was now 47 carefully constructed ones, and thought about what it would mean to add a training component, to take the methodology she'd built in isolation and make it something that could be replicated and transferred and improved by people who would find the gaps she hadn't found yet. "Yes," she said, "I can build that." The review session ended at hour 5 with a conditional approval. The framework would move forward to the next stage of formal review with 3 required revisions, all of which were substantive improvements rather than obstacles. Vasquez's expansion proposal was included as a formal addendum. She walked out of the review building into the late afternoon with Briggs beside her and Okafor a half step behind, and the air was cleaner than it had been all week, the weather system that had been sitting over the base finally moving east. "Training component," Briggs said. "I know." "That's 3 times the original scope." "I know." "When are you going to sleep?" "I sleep," she said. "Occasionally," he said. Not unkindly. She looked at the flight line. Tail 781 was back in rotation. The engine had been replaced rather than repaired, and the aircraft had been signed off clean 2 days ago. She hadn't flown it yet. She'd been waiting for a moment that felt right, which was not something she usually waited for, and she was aware that the waiting itself was information about where she was. "I'm going to request a canyon familiarization flight tomorrow," she said, "just to run the updated model against the actual conditions. I changed the kilometer 26 parameters, and I want to verify." Briggs looked at her. "You want company?" "It's a solo flight." "That's not what I asked." She thought about the canyon, the walls, the dark, the floor coming up fast at kilometer 26 with 30 feet of margin. She thought about flying it in daylight, clean, with new engine readings and a revised model and all the things she now knew that she hadn't known the first time. "Ground observation would be useful," she said, "if you can get access to a position on the southern rim." "I'll manage it." He said it the way he said most things, directly, without making it into more than it was. She nodded and looked at the flight line and thought about tomorrow. What she didn't think about, because she had trained herself not to think about things she couldn't affect, was what was still waiting. The training program, the second review stage, the 3 required revisions, Vask's expansion, and everything it implied about the scope of what she'd walked into. What she did think about was the flight manual entry on Ashford Canyon, the inadequate one, the static one, the one written under average conditions and never revised. She had been meaning for 8 months to write a better one. She had the data. She had the methodology. She had 240 pages of material and a post-mission notes update and a revised parameter at kilometer 26 and the input of a SEAL chief who had described the terrain from the ground while she'd described it from the air, and together they'd made the model more accurate. She was going to write a better flight manual entry. It was not a dramatic thing. It was a document that would sit in an operations system and get read by pilots before they flew a terrain feature that had already killed people. And some of those pilots would make better decisions because the document was accurate, and some of them might come home because of it, and they would never know her name. She was all right with that. What she was not all right with was the message that came through on her phone at 1847 as she was walking back to her quarters. It was from Okafor. 2 sentences. JAG has opened a secondary review. Strand's voluntary statement triggered a broader inquiry into restriction filing practices across the wing, not just your case. She stopped walking and read it twice. The second sentence was, Greer's letter of reprimand has been escalated pending the secondary review. There may be additional findings. She stood on the path between the operations building and the quarters block and looked at her phone and understood what this meant. The secondary review wasn't about her. It was about the pattern, whether the restriction filing mechanism had been used improperly in other cases against other pilots, in ways that hadn't produced a crisis dramatic enough to surface the problem. Whether what had happened to her was singular or systemic in the narrower sense, not just a gap in how terrain intelligence was built, but a gap in how administrative authority was being exercised. The secondary review could run for months. It could involve testimony from pilots she'd never met. It could produce findings that went well beyond what the initial investigation had uncovered, and consequences that went well beyond Greer's letter of reprimand. Or it could close quietly in 3 weeks with no additional findings. She didn't know which. She couldn't know which. She had no data on the broader restriction filing history of the wing, and no way to acquire it, and the secondary review was not something she was a party to or could affect. She put her phone in her pocket and kept walking. Inside her quarters, she made coffee and opened her laptop to the framework document and looked at the 3 required revisions that the review board had specified. She opened a new section and began to write. The coffee went cold before she noticed it. At 21:14, her phone rang again, Okafor's number. The secondary review pulled the wing restriction filing records for the past 3 years, he said without preamble. Yours is not the only file with a timing anomaly between a pilot's performance evaluation and a subsequent restriction filing. She held the phone and waited. There are 4 others, he said. 2 of them are still on active restriction. The room was very quiet. How long? She said. One has been on restriction for 7 months, the other for 14. She sat with that. 14 months. Someone had been sitting on the ground for 14 months. Are they being notified? She said. The JAG office is notifying them tonight. She thought about what 14 months looked like. She had been on restriction for weeks, and it had felt like a compression, a narrowing of what was possible, a slow, bureaucratic suffocation dressed up in procedural language. 14 months of that, with no Okafor appearing at the door, no crisis dramatic enough to surface the problem, no canyon that needed someone specific enough to make the gap visible. Just 14 months of sitting on the ground. Who are they? She said. I can't share that yet. The JAG process is running. But they're going to be reviewed under the same framework. Yes. She stood up and walked to the window. The flight line was dark, the aircraft chalked and silent. 781 was out there somewhere in that row of shadows, with its new engine and its clean maintenance record. The training component that Vask proposed, she said slowly. If the problem is broader than one case, If there are pilots across the wing who've been managed into corners through this mechanism, then the training component is more urgent than we framed it. Yes, Okafor said. And the framework needs a section on the restriction filing review process, not just going forward, a mechanism for auditing existing restrictions against the performance record timeline. She was thinking faster than she was speaking, and she made herself slow down. That's a significant addition. It's the right addition. It'll push the timeline. Probably. She looked at the dark flight line and thought about the two pilots she didn't know who were finding out tonight that someone had noticed, finally, that something was wrong with their files. She thought about what that phone call would feel like after 7 months, after 14. I'm going to add the audit section tonight, she said. Send me whatever the JAG office can share about the general structure of the other cases. Not the names, the pattern. I'll send what I can. And Okafor. She paused. The two pilots who are still on restriction. When the JAG review clears them, and I think it will clear them, they're going to need something to come back to. What are you proposing? She thought about Kowalski's office and the topographic display and the draft framework with her name on it, and she thought about Vask's asking if she could build a training component, and she thought about the answer she'd given him. I'm proposing that the program has more than one terrain specialist, she said, when they're ready. A silence on the line, not a long one. Write it into the framework, Okafor said. She hung up and sat back at the desk and opened the framework document and started a new section, and the night settled around the base and the flight line and the canyon 40 kilometers northwest of where she sat, and she wrote until the words came out exactly the way she needed them to, which took until 0130 and was not smooth or easy or efficient because nothing real was, and she had stopped expecting otherwise a long time ago. The audit section took 11 days to write properly. Not because the concept was complicated, the concept was straightforward. Cross-reference restriction filing dates against pilot performance evaluation timelines, flag anomalies where a restriction followed a comparative evaluation within a defined window, route flag cases to an independent review panel rather than the same chain of command that had generated the restriction. The concept was simple. Making it institutional language that couldn't be reinterpreted into uselessness required the kind of precision that cost time, and she spent the time because spending it now was the difference between a policy that worked and a policy that looked like it worked. Okafor sent her the pattern data from the JAG office on the second day. Not the names, as he'd promised, just the structure of the cases. The timing anomalies in the 4 other files followed variations of the same shape. A pilot performs well on a metric that reflects unfavorably on a senior officer's assessment. A restriction is filed within 60 days. The restriction language is procedurally complete, but the safety basis is thin. In 2 cases, the restriction had been filed by the same reviewing officer across a span of 14 months, which was a pattern that the JAG secondary review was currently unpackaging with what Laya understood, from the careful way Okafor described it, was considerable interest. She did not know the name of the reviewing officer. She did not need to. The audit section was not designed for the specific case. It was designed for the shape of the problem, and the shape was clear enough. She sent the completed section to Okafor on day 11, and he read it the same day and called her that evening and said, "This is going to make some people uncomfortable." "It should," she said. "The discomfort is useful," he said. "Useful discomfort is what policy is for." She thought about that for a moment and found she agreed with it more than she'd expected to. The second formal review convened 3 weeks after the first. This session included Vask's, who had flown in from Air Component headquarters specifically for it, and 2 new officers she hadn't met, one from the Inspector General's office, one from the Office of Military Personnel Policy, both of whom had clearly read the full document package and came in with specific questions about specific sections. The JAG secondary review findings had been shared with the panel in advance, which meant the room already understood that the framework was no longer operating in a vacuum. Leia presented the audit section herself. She walked through the methodology, the flagging criteria, the independent review panel structure. The IG officer asked the hardest questions. Not hostile, but thorough in the way that people are thorough when they're trying to find the weak points before the policy is live rather than after. She answered them with the data she had and acknowledged where the data was incomplete. And in 2 places she said, "That's a gap in the current draft and here's what I'd need to close it," which the IG officer wrote down. The personnel policy officer said, near the end, the audit mechanism is going to surface cases that have been closed administratively for years. Some of those cases involve officers who are no longer in the command structure. The question of remedy for historical cases is not addressed in this draft. "I know," Leah said. "That's intentional. The remedy framework for historical cases is a separate document, and it's outside my authority to write. What I can write is the forward-looking mechanism and the referral structure for historical cases once they're identified. The remedy question belongs to the IG's office." The IG officer looked at her with the expression of someone who had just been handed a reasonable amount of work. "Fair," he said, and wrote something down. The second review closed with a full approval, no required revisions. Basque stayed after the room cleared and shook her hand, an actual handshake, not a formal one, and said, "The training component is the right call. When you're ready to build it, I want to be in the room." "You will be," she said. The JAG secondary review produced its formal findings 6 weeks after it opened. The findings were released on a Tuesday morning, and Leah read them in the operations building on her lunch break because she had a full morning of framework implementation work, and she wasn't going to rearrange her day for a document she'd been told was coming. She read it straight through in 40 minutes. The reviewing officer implicated in the 2 related cases, a lieutenant colonel named Prue Darton, whom she had never met and whose name she was learning for the first time in this document, had been found to have used the restriction filing mechanism in a pattern consistent with suppression of competitive performance metrics across a period of 18 months. The finding used careful language, but the meaning was unambiguous. Darton had identified pilots whose performance reflected poorly on his own evaluations and had used administrative restriction to manage them out of visibility. The formal consequences were not subtle. Darton received a formal reprimand, a directed transfer out of the wing, and a flag on his promotion file that the IG document described as permanent. The 2 pilots still on restriction under his filings had their restrictions formally vacated, their records cleared, and their files annotated with language that acknowledged the administrative error and its impact on their careers. Greer's escalated case produced a finding that went beyond the original letter of reprimand. The escalation had surfaced a secondary issue. The operational assessment that had declared the canyon non-penetrable on the night of the mission had been signed off by Greer without full review of available intelligence, a finding that the IG framed not as negligence but as a command culture problem, a pattern of approving assessments based on organizational habit rather than current data. The consequence was a directed transition out of squadron command within 90 days to a non-command role in the wing structure. She read that section twice, not with satisfaction exactly, with the specific feeling of watching a system correct itself slowly and imperfectly, and still, finally, correctly. Strand's counseling entry was unchanged. The JAG review had looked at his case and found nothing beyond what the initial board had already documented. He was still at Kessler, still flying, still working on the command structure rebuttal section of her framework that he'd committed to months ago. She had received 3 drafts from him over the past weeks. The third one was good, precise, internally consistent, clearly written by someone who understood the system he was critiquing from the inside. She had told him so, without making more of it than it was, and he had said, "I'll keep working on it," and she'd said, "Good," and that had been the conversation. The 2 pilots whose restrictions were vacated were named in the findings as Captain Vera Moss and First Lieutenant Thomas Aldrich. She had still not met either of them. She knew from Okafor that Moss had been on restriction for 14 months and Aldrich for 7, and that both of them had been notified the evening the secondary review opened, and that Moss had returned to flight status within 48 hours of the restriction being vacated, which told Leah something specific about the kind of person Moss was. She emailed them both that afternoon. Short emails, not emotional, not elaborate. She introduced herself, told them about the terrain intelligence program and the training component, said there would be a role for qualified pilots when the curriculum was ready, and asked if they'd be interested in hearing more when the time came. Moss replied within 20 minutes. I've been waiting for something like this for a while. Yes. Aldrich replied the following morning, I don't know what to say. Yes. She thought, you don't have to say anything, just come fly. Nchimab. Reyes arrived at Kessler on a Wednesday in late autumn, 7 months after the surgery. He came with Briggs, who had driven him from Landstrom, and he walked into the operations building under his own power with a gait that was still slightly careful on his left side. The chest wound had involved a rib, and the rib had involved a secondary complication during recovery that had added 6 weeks to the timeline, and he carried that extra 6 weeks in the way he moved, a slight protective tendency that his physical therapist had told him would fade and that he wasn't entirely convinced would. Leia was in the middle of a framework training session with Moss and Aldrich when Briggs texted her. She wrapped the session early. Moss gave her a look that said she understood. Aldrich was already on his feet, and she walked to the front of the operations building. Reyes was taller than she'd pictured from the handwriting on the note. He was maybe 28, with the compact build of someone who had spent years being useful in small spaces, and he looked at her with the direct regard of a person who had done a lot of thinking about this moment, and was finding that the reality of it was different from the thinking. Major Vance, he said. Major, she said. I'm not going to say anything formal. Good, he said. I practiced something formal on the drive, and it was terrible. She almost laughed. How's the rib? Better than it was. Worse than I tell my PT. He shifted his weight slightly and then stopped himself doing it, which told her he was aware of the habit and working against it. I wanted to say thank you in person. I've been waiting until I could stand here and do it without... He stopped, tried again. Without it being a thing where I'm just laying in a bed somewhere being grateful. I wanted to say it as myself. She looked at him for a moment. You said it, she said. I heard it. He nodded, and something shifted in his face. Not relief exactly, but the release of something that had been carrying a long time. Briggs was standing slightly behind him, with his hands in his pockets and the expression of a man who was not going to insert himself into a moment that wasn't his. There's something else, Reyes said. I've been talking to Briggs and to some people at Landstrom about... He paused. About what it means when someone knows something that the system doesn't think to use, when the knowledge is there and the structure doesn't reach it. I've been thinking about that a lot. And, she said, and I want to do something with that thinking when I'm back to full duty. I don't know exactly what, but I've been talking to the medical staff about a ground-level terrain assessment program, something that pairs with the airside work, uses the ground perspective the same way you use the air perspective. He looked at her carefully, like he was waiting to see if this was something or nothing. Briggs said you're building a training curriculum. I am. Is there room for a ground-level component? She thought about the framework. She thought about the session she'd just been running with Moss and Aldrich and the gap in the training design that Vasks had pointed out last week. The airside methodology was strong, but the integration with ground observation was still underdeveloped, still relying on coordination rather than shared methodology. Yes, she said. There's room. He let out a breath. Okay, good. He looked slightly less like he'd been carrying something. I was worried that was an overreach. It's not an overreach, she said. It's what the program needs. Briggs met her eyes over Reyes's shoulder, and she read the look correctly. I may have suggested he bring this to you. She gave him nothing back, which was its own kind of answer. The formal program launch happened on a Thursday in early winter, 6 months and 11 days after the night of the extraction. The ceremony was not elaborate. Kowalski had specifically requested that it not be elaborate. Her word to Okafor had been functional, which Leia appreciated in a general the way she appreciated it in anyone. The attendees were the people who had built the thing and the people who would use it, plus a small group of senior officers whose presence was required by protocol and who looked at the program documentation with the expression of people encountering something more substantive than they'd expected. Kowalski spoke for 4 minutes. She described the program as a structural correction. Not an innovation, she said, but a correction. The knowledge had always existed. The question was whether the structure would allow it to be used. The program was the structure saying yes. She did not describe Leia as a hero. She described her as the person who had built the knowledge and the person who had built the structure. And she said those things were equally important, which Leia thought was accurate. Leia spoke for 6 minutes. She described the methodology, the training framework, the audit mechanism. She described the terrain intelligence approach as teachable, not because what she did was ordinary, but because the method behind it was, and the method could be transferred to other pilots and other terrain features and other situations where the gap between static guidance and dynamic reality was costing people something they shouldn't have to pay. She mentioned Moss and Aldrich by name. She mentioned Reyes's ground-level component. She did not mention Greer or Darton or the secondary review, because the program was not about what had gone wrong. It was about what came next. Briggs was in the 3rd row. He was not in his dress uniform. He was in his working uniform, which she'd noticed when he came in and which she thought was exactly correct. He watched her speak with the focused attention she'd come to recognize as simply how he was present for things. And when she was done, he didn't applaud louder than anyone else or stand before anyone else or make anything of it, because he was not a person who made things of things, and she had come to understand that this was one of the ways he was similar to her. After the ceremony, in the corridor outside the conference room, Moss found her. Vera Moss was in her mid-30s, compact and precise, with the quality of someone who had spent 14 months on the ground keeping themselves sharp for the moment the ground ended. She had been flying for 6 weeks since her restriction was vacated, and she was visibly, quietly furious about the 14 months in a way that she was managing through work rather than through expression, which Leia recognized as the right instinct and the one she would have made herself. "The Canyon familiarization flight," Moss said. "The training rotation? When does it start?" "Next week," Leia said. "You're on the roster." "I want to run the full data set, not the condensed version." "The full set is what I built the curriculum around." Moss nodded. "I've been reading your methodology notes, the kilometer 26 correction, the way you documented the model failure." She paused. "Most people would have left that out." "Most people would have," Leia said. Leia. "Why didn't you?" Leia thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because the error is the most useful part," she said. "Anyone can document where the model works. The places where it fails are where the next version gets better." Moss looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not quite admiration and not quite recognition. Something between the two, the look of someone who had been thinking a thing for a long time in isolation and was now hearing it said out loud. "Yeah," she said. "Okay." She walked back toward the main room. Aldrich appeared in her place almost immediately, which felt slightly coordinated. "I signed up for the ground-level coordination module," he said. "Reyes's component." "Good. Is he going to be running it himself when he's back to full duty?" "That's the plan." Aldrich nodded slowly. He was younger than Moss and less contained about it, and he looked at her with the unguarded expression of someone who hadn't yet learned to be careful about what their face said. "I was on restriction for 7 months," he said. "I kept thinking, if I could just get someone to look at the actual file, the actual timeline, the actual data, if someone would just look at it." He stopped. "Thank you for being the case that made someone look." She held that for a moment. "You would have found a way to surface it," she said. "Maybe," he said. "Eventually." He looked uncertain about that. "You stayed sharp," she said. 7 months. You stayed ready. That's not nothing." He looked at her like she'd said something that cost him something to hear, the way truth sometimes did. And then he nodded and went back inside. She flew 781 over Ashford Canyon alone on a Friday afternoon, 3 days after the program launch, in clear cold air with visibility that ran to the horizon and the revised model running on her HUD and the canyon laid out below her exactly as she had mapped it. She entered at the western mouth and flew the full length, low and precise, checking each section against the updated parameters. The thermal behavior at the shoulder matched the revised model within 4%. Kilometer 26 was within 2% on the lateral wind reading, which meant the correction she'd made after the mission was right, and the model was better than it had been. She flew it twice. The second pass was slower, more deliberate. The way you fly terrain when you're teaching yourself something rather than proving something. She noted 2 additional variations she hadn't captured in the current documentation. minor, within operational tolerance, but real, and she would add them to the notes when she landed. At the canyon exit, she pulled up and climbed and turned south toward the base, and the canyon fell behind her, and the air was clean at altitude, and the aircraft was exactly as she knew it to be. And she thought about all of it. Not in sequence, not analytically, just let it be what it was for a few minutes. She thought about the 8 months of evenings, the 47 hours that had become 240 pages, that had become a framework, that had become a program that was going to put better trained pilots in better informed positions in bad situations so that fewer people ended up in a canyon with no aircraft coming. She thought about Reyes's note. "We didn't know your name, we knew you." She thought about Moss saying, "I've been waiting for something like this," and Aldrich saying, "I don't know what to say," and the way both of those responses were honest, and both of them mattered, and neither of them was the same. She thought about kilometer 26 and the 30 feet of margin, and the fact that she had written it down exactly, not because it made her look good, but because it was true, and truth was the only thing that made the next version of anything better than the last. She didn't think about what she'd sacrificed for the 8 months. Not the promotion she hadn't chased, not the evenings she'd spent at her desk while other people were at the bar, not the years of being categorized as difficult when she was actually precise, which is a thing that happens to people who are precise in institutions that have learned to mistake precision for inconvenience. She had thought about all of that at various points over the past months, and she had come to a conclusion about it that was not comfortable but was real. The system had not been built to accommodate what she was, and she had spent years working around that fact, and the canyon had been the moment when working around it stopped being sufficient, and she had had to be exactly herself, whether the system had room for it or not. She had been exactly herself. And the things she had learned slowly and imperfectly and without any clean moment of revelation, was that being exactly yourself in the face of a system that wants you to be slightly less than that is not defiance. It's just accuracy. Accurate people build accurate models. Accurate models save lives. The defiance was never the point. The accuracy was. She crossed the base boundary at 1647 and called in her position and descended toward runway 04 in the late afternoon light, and the landing was not smooth. She came in slightly fast and the nose wanted to drift, and she corrected it and got down cleanly but not elegantly, and she taxied to the hard stand and shut down and sat in the cockpit for a moment after the engines went quiet. The ground crew was already there. Same crewman as before, the one who had climbed the ladder on the night she came back from the canyon and asked if she was good. He climbed the ladder again now and looked at her face. "Good flight, Major?" "Good flight," she said. She meant it. She climbed down and walked across the flight line in the cold, late light and thought about Moss's first training flight next week, and Reyes's ground component curriculum that she was going to help him build, and the 2 additional canyon variations she needed to add to the notes, and the IG office's historical case referral structure that she was meeting with Brennan to review on Monday. She thought about all the work there was still to do, and she felt the specific feeling that the work gave her. Not excitement exactly, not relief, something more durable than either of those. The feeling of a person who has found the right problem and has the right tools for it and understands that solving it will reveal the next problem, and that is not a disappointment, but the whole point. The flight line stretched out behind her. The canyon was 40 kilometers northwest in the mountains, doing what it always did. Shifting, breathing, behaving in ways that defied the static guidance because the world was dynamic, and the people who understood it had to be dynamic too. She had built the map. She was teaching other people to build maps. And somewhere, in a situation she couldn't predict, in terrain she hadn't studied yet, the work she was doing now was going to matter to someone who would never know her name. She was all right with that. She had always been all right with that. What she had not always been all right with was the idea that being all right with it meant being invisible, meant accepting that the system got to decide the shape of her contribution. That was the thing that had changed. Not her, not the canyon, the structure around the knowledge, finally updated to reflect what the knowledge was worth. She pushed through the door into the operations building, where the light was on and Moss was at a workstation running the canyon data set on her own time, already preparing, and Leia walked past her without interrupting because that was exactly the right thing to be doing, and she sat at her own desk and opened her notes and started writing down what the canyon had shown her today. Some people spend years being the most capable person in the room that nobody sees. They do the work anyway. They build the knowledge anyway. They stay ready anyway, not because they're certain someone will notice, but because the alternative, see, letting the work go undone because the credit isn't coming, costs more than the waiting. That cost is real. It is paid in evenings and in silence and in the particular exhaustion of being managed sideways by people smaller than the problem they're supposed to be solving. It does not always resolve. Not every canyon produces a crisis visible enough to surface the gap. Not every person who does the work gets to stand in a room and watch the system finally catch up. But the work is still the right thing, not because it gets rewarded, because it's accurate. And accuracy in the end is the only thing that actually reaches the ground.